Well, so much about who we are as a species is about how we categorize ourselves, our race, our faith, our gender. It is these categories, among others, that set our species apart from the rest and enabled Homo sapiens to dominate. Joining us now for more, we welcome back to our program Yuval Noah Harari. He is the author of Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. He's also a lecturer at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Welcome back.
Hello.
Okay, so yesterday we talked about sapiens becoming the dominant species, the way the agricultural revolution, well, I don't know, basically ruined everything. Changed everything, okay, and how sapiens evolved. Today I want to focus more about our humanity, and I want to ask, how did it influence the way humanity organized itself? What was the change with the agricultural revolution?
Well, first of all, we need to go a few steps earlier and realize that the reason Homo sapiens gained control of the world is thanks to its unique organizational capabilities. We control the world because we are the only animals that can cooperate flexibly in large numbers. Other animals, like the social insects, the bees and the ants, they can cooperate in large numbers, but not flexibly. There is one way in which a beehive functions, and if there is a new opportunity or danger, then bees cannot reinvent their social system overnight. They cannot execute the queen and have a republic or a communist dictatorship of bees. You have other animals like wolves and chimpanzees that cooperate much more flexibly than ants and bees, but they do so only very small numbers, because for chimpanzees to cooperate, they actually need to know one another intimately. Homo sapiens is unique. We are the only ones that can cooperate very flexibly, but do so in huge numbers, thousands, millions, billions of complete strangers who don't know each other. And this is what gave us control of the planet. And what enables us to do that is basically our imagination, our ability to create and to spread fictions. We're the only animal that believes in things that exist only in its own imagination. You can never convince a chimpanzee to do something by promising that chimpanzee that, look, if you do this, after you die, you'll go to chimpanzee heaven, and there you'll receive lots and lots of bananas for your good deeds. So now do this. No chimpanzee will ever believe such a story, which is why chimpanzees don't come together to build cathedrals or to go on crusades and jihads. Humans are the only ones that can believe such fictions, and this is why we control the world and not anybody else.
You said that change in how we organize ourselves, I mean, predates the agricultural revolution. But what happened during that time period that made us, I don't know if I should say better at it, or made it more of a priority for us?
Agriculture gave us the material basis for cooperating in much larger numbers. Even before agriculture, people, humans of the species Homo sapiens, had the cognitive ability to cooperate with strangers. We see, for example, trade networks existing well before agriculture. But without agriculture, you couldn't have large concentrations of humans in the same place because you couldn't feed them. Once you have agriculture, you can start concentrating thousands, then hundreds of thousands, eventually millions of people into cities, into fortresses, temples, and so forth. And this is the basis for really large and sophisticated networks of cooperation, whether it's on the level of the city or it's on the level of the kingdom and the empire.
Our networks of cooperation tend overall to be hierarchical in the ways that we organize. Is there a reason for that?
Yes, in almost all known societies, at least if the society is big, you have like tens of thousands of tens of millions of people in the same network, a hierarchy is formed, and you divide people into different categories according to race or ethnicity or religion or whatever. The categories are usually fictional. People think they are natural, but they are fictional, they are pure invention. There is no real difference in ability between the rich and the poor, between Africans and Europeans, between Christians and Hindus and Muslims. But in our imagination, we think that there is a big difference. And therefore we categorize people, you're a Hindu, you go there. You're a Christian, you go there. But all societies do that because simply you cannot function in a big society unless you categorize people into, according to some system, and you always think that your way of categorizing people is right and natural, and all other ways are ridiculous. So it's the same thing today. We, at least in the West, we think that racial categorization is ridiculous and obscene, but we think that categorizing people according to how much money they have, oh, this is perfectly okay and natural.
And as we categorize people, no matter what sort of parameters there are to those categories, there's always this element of being oppressive and exploitive. That's just part of doing this, I imagine.
Yeah, you have more oppressive and less oppressive societies. It's not like it's all the same. There are significant differences, but we don't know of any completely egalitarian society free from all unjustified categorization and exploitation. We simply don't know of any such society.
So what you're saying is that people who make the argument for divisions based on race, for example, they would say there is a biological basis to this. You're saying not so. Just start in our heads. We've just made this up.
As far as we know, all these divisions exist only in our heads. And again, if you believe it, you'll say, no, it's natural, it's biological. But maybe the most important thing to know about biology and culture is that biology enables and culture forbids. Biology enables people to behave in very different ways. Anything a human can do is natural. Any, if you think about sex, any kind of sexual relations which humans can actually engage in, they are natural. You cannot break the law of nature, the laws of nature. The only things that break the laws of nature don't really exist. But then comes along culture, and culture takes some part of this spectrum of natural behaviors and says, this is unnatural, this is wrong. And this is our way of saying, I don't like it, or my God doesn't like it. So we say it's unnatural, but actually it's just culture. It has nothing to do with biology or culture.
Okay, there is the argument, though, that these kinds of divisions or categories and things make us evolve at a more rapid rate.
Yes, the idea is that for a society to function, it's easier when you have a division of labor, different people doing different things. And instead of, how do you decide who will get what job, who will get what position in society? So the idea of most society is to create some fictional categorization, again, according to religion or gender or race, and it makes life so much easier. Because
depending where you fall on the dividing line.
No, it doesn't make life easier for the, say, the oppressed individual, but it makes life much easier for the society. Because you encounter a stranger, you don't really need to get to know that stranger. All you need to do is, in one society, look at his or her skin color. In another society, all you need to do is look at his bank account, and that's it. You don't really need to get to know this person intimately.
Okay, I want to ask about the biggest division, probably historically, which is men and women. And you write in your book that for ages and ages, that men have been able to physically coerce women throughout history. How is that possible? How come?
And the answer is that we don't really know. It's one of the biggest mysteries of history is gender relations. Now, many people think that this is easy to explain because men, on average, are physically stronger than women, so obviously they had the ability to coerce them and to control them. But the thing is that in all ape societies, including Homo sapiens societies, power, social power, does not correlate with physical strength. It correlates with social skills. If you go, say, to a chimpanzee group, among chimpanzees, the dominant individuals are those with the best social skills that can create strong coalitions of supporters. Among bonobo chimpanzees, females dominate societies, even though the females are weaker physically. Even among Homo sapiens, you see that people in their 50s and 60s usually dominate people in their 20s, even though people in their 20s are physically stronger. And when you look at organizations like the Catholic Church, so the Pope is not the strongest Christian male. He didn't become pope by beating up all the bishops and other cardinals and priests and whatever. It all depends on social skills. And it's often argued that women have better social skills. They are better at understanding what other people are thinking, what other people want, and creating compromises and alliances. So how come, even though they are supposedly have better social skills, they nevertheless find themselves in most societies dominated by men? We don't have a good theory to explain that.
I wish we did. I want to talk about our sense of justice. And if we look at our social order and the hierarchical structure of it, to what degree is that sort of rooted in our ideals of justice?
To a very large extent. Each society has its own ideas about justice. And again, each society thinks that its idea of justice is natural or is divinely ordained or something like that. But all of them, as far as we know, are inventions of human beings. Human rights are a fictional invention, just like God and heaven and the Ten Commandments. They are not a biological reality. Just as woodpeckers or ostriches or crocodiles don't have rights, so Homo sapiens, biologically speaking, have no rights. And for most of history, nobody knew anything about the existence of these things' rights. It's only in the last few centuries that people in some parts of the world began to weave these stories about human rights and convinced everybody else to believe that. And today, most of the world believe this story in one way or the other. It may be a very attractive and beneficial story, but we need to remember that it's just a story in our mind.
That is fascinating. I've never thought of human rights in that way, that this is a construct of, we believe in it. We've decided that this is worth believing in.
Yeah, but you take a human and you cut him open, you look inside, you find the heart and the kidneys and DNA and blood and whatever, you don't find any rights. The only place you find rights is in the stories that people invent and tell one another. Okay.
I want to spend some time talking about one of the historically most important and enduring forms of human organization. That's the empire. You write that empires have been one of the most common forms of the way we organize politically for the last, I think, 2,500 years, you say. Why is it? Why is that? Why are we so drawn to empires?
Empires are very inclusive systems of government. Most people in the past, and this goes back to really our biological tendencies, they tend to divide themselves into us versus them. So that in many tribal languages, for example, the name of the tribe simply means people. Everybody who doesn't belong to our tribe is not really human. Like you go to the Sudan, and until today you have this big conflict between the Dinka and the Nur in South Sudan. And you look at the language. In Dinka language, Dinka means humans. And in Nur language, Nur means real humans. So anybody who is not Dinka is not really human. And you find this way of thinking all over the world. And then come the empire. And the basic idea of empire is a very inclusive idea that all humans can be part of a single political system, which is the empire. We tend to think about empires as being evil, as being the bad guys of history. But this is very recent way of thinking, especially in the West. And we tend to ignore the fact that empires have been responsible for much of human culture over the last 2,500 years. And all of us, in a way, are the inheritors of empires. Like this interview takes place in English, which is the language of the British Empire. And this is why it was the biggest empire in history. So this is why it is now the common language. And most people today in the world, whether in China or the Middle East or South America, they speak and they think and they dream in the language of empires, be it Han Chinese or Spanish or Arabic. These are all imperial languages.
Interesting. Okay. What would you consider a successful empire?
The most successful empires are the empires that integrate their different subject people to such an extent then even after the empire falls, and every empire in the end falls, the subject people no longer view it as an enemy or as an alien entity. They identify with the empire and they continue its legacy after the empire is gone. This is, for example, what happened in the Middle East with the Arab Islamic Caliphate, which began as an alien conquering force, but eventually most people in the Middle East, they adopted the language of the empire, Arabic. They adopted the religion of the empire, Islam, and even after the caliphate collapsed, they continued to view themselves as Arabs and as Muslims. And you find the same thing happening in China, and the same thing today in the world. After the collapse of the European empires like the British or Spanish and so forth, they were very successful in this sense that even after their collapse, their ideas that they brought to the rest of the world, like capitalism, like nationalism, like socialism, these ideas continue to thrive even after the empires have collapsed.
And if that's a success in terms of empire building, what would you say is the negative legacy of empire?
This is far more familiar and obvious. All the immense violence and cruelty that empires inflict while conquering their territories and keeping all the subjugated people in their place at least until they managed to somehow inculcate them with the culture of the empire.
I think people would say that Europeans, if you think of empires, we would say that Europeans seem to embrace empire and imperialism more readily than other peoples in the world, although you just mentioned other people in the world embracing that. But is there, when you look at it historically, I mean, is there a reason that Europeans seem to embrace this idea of empire more?
Actually, I think that Europeans least embrace the idea compared with anybody else. For instance, in China, when you look at the Chinese history, it's very obvious to Chinese that whenever there was a unified empire, this was good. And any situation in which the empire collapsed and you had many individual independent entities in what is today China, this is considered the bad times, chaos. Europeans in the last few decades are one of the only cultures in history, of recent history, that actually viewed empire as a bad thing. You had, at least since World War II, this view of empire and imperialism becoming the worst swear words in the political lexicon, and nobody wants to be called an empire or to be identified as an imperialist. This is a recent phenomenon of the last 60 years or so, and I also think it's a passing trend. Probably we are heading back towards an imperial age when maybe this time the entire planet will be controlled by a single empire with a single culture and a single economy.
Okay, so what you're saying is that we've been looking at the history of imperialism with sort of short-sightedness. We've only been looking at the last number of decades. So put that into context. When we look at the history of imperialism, what's the takeaway from that?
As I said earlier, most languages, most religions, most cultures we see today in the world are the legacies, the creations of empires. Whether it's the British or the Arabic or the Chinese or the Roman Empire. And in this sense, empires are one of the most important players in history. And in ethical terms, it's very difficult to simply label them as all evil and corrupt and, again, the bad guys of history. Because if empires are the bad guys of history, it means, first of all, that the bad guys won. And secondly, that most of us are the inheritors of the evil people, not of the good people. At least in our culture, maybe not genetically. Maybe genetically we are descendants of the oppressed people, but in our language, our way of thinking, our culture, our religion, most of us are the inheritors of the empires.
We've been talking about history for 2 days now, and your book's called A Brief History of Humankind. Let me ask you a big question. Does history have a direction?
Yes, in several senses, yes. One direction of history is the unification of humankind. If you look at history from the viewpoint of thousands of years, you see that, yes, there are setbacks, for instance, when empires collapse and break up. But for thousands of years, humankind is becoming more and more unified. And you can say that today, the whole planet has really become a single system. You see it most obviously in the economic sphere, where previously you had thousands of different small economies independent of one another. Say 1,000 years ago, there were no economic relations whatsoever between the Middle East and Central America and Australia. And today you have connections. Similarly, in the ways that people view the world, previously in each area of the world, people had a different view of the natural world, of the cosmos, of the human body, of disease. Doctors in Japan and India and South America had very different ideas about what disease is and how to treat it. But today in the world, everywhere you go, you find basically the same scientific understanding. If you have a heart attack or you have cancer, and you go to a hospital in Toronto or Tokyo or Tehran or Tel Aviv, the doctors will think roughly the same things. They will use the same equipment, the same medicines. They will give you the same treatment.
And as we become more unified, are we also evolving to become more moral?
More moral, this is much more difficult to say. In the treatments of animals, for example, certainly not. And if you look at the 20th century or what's happening today in the world, there is plenty of improvement that still needs to be done. But at least in one sense, I think we have made progress, which is the decline in international violence. Now, this may sound surprising to many viewers. We hear a lot of news. I come from Israel. I know that there are still a lot of wars today in the world. But compared to any previous time in history, we are living in the most peaceful time of all. For the first time in history, there is a kind of new peace, new definition of peace. Previously in history, when two countries or kingdoms or tribes were at peace, peace meant the temporary absence of conflict, of war. Everybody knew that if France and Germany in 1913 were at peace, still war might erupt next year. Today, for the first time in history, in many areas around the world, war has become unthinkable. When you say there is peace between France and Germany, or Canada and the United States, or Argentina and Brazil, what you mean is that it is simply unthinkable that a war might erupt next year between these countries. And this is for the first time in history that we have such a thing. And I think that it has a lot to do with two developments. First of all, the invention of nuclear weapons, which made international war, at least on the global level, into collective suicide. So the superpowers had to develop other means of resolving conflicts. And secondly, it's the changing nature of the economy. For most of history, the economy was material-based. The main economic assets, wealth, consisted of material assets like wheat fields or gold mines or oil fields. And then war made sense because you could conquer all this wealth by war. Now, for the first time, the main asset in the economy is knowledge and not material things. It's a knowledge-based economy. And the wonderful thing about knowledge is that you cannot conquer it by force. So there is less reason to wage war. Most international wars today in the world happen in those areas where the economy is still old-fashioned, material economy, like the Middle East. You wage war, you win, you get the oil fields. It makes sense. But if you go, say, to California, let's say the Chinese want to invade California and conquer Silicon Valley. And let's say that they manage to conquer California. They won't gain anything because the wealth of Silicon Valley is not in silicon mines. There are no silicon mines in Silicon Valley. The wealth is in the minds of Google engineers and Facebook engineers and so forth, and you cannot conquer these ideas by force.
Yuval, thank you. You've given us lots to think about and challenge. Well, I mean, it's a nice antidote that you sort of ended us on there, thinking about that war is not our natural state of being in many parts of the world. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.